Today on The State of Us, what's next without affirmative action? While many Americans will celebrate the decision to end affirmative action, many others will mourn it, and understandably so. Any sentient being should recognize that the long and deep history of racial oppression in America leaves a powerful legacy, and that race does still matter in shaping opportunity. That's according to an opinion piece in the New York Times Sunday edition. Importantly, the Supreme Court did not say that the goal of racial diversity on campus is impermissible. It struck down one particular set of means, which raises the question that we're going to look at today. What are the best ways to allow universities to help repair our nation's egregious history on race without employing racial preference? Better yet, could those new strategies also recognize the rising significance of class disadvantage in American life in a way that racial preference never did? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson.
Well, this is a great article for us because while we've kind of not talked about affirmative action decision a lot, this one does what we like to do on the show, and that is it gives a solution. So instead of celebrating or bemoaning, whichever camp you're in, we're going to tell you a way that it's possible that maybe we can do an even better job of college admission. Actually, there are two. There's another one that I don't know how much we're going to get to talk about, but there are two options here that deal with getting disadvantaged students, which, you know, some people immediately jump to the conclusion, well, economic disadvantaged students, you're talking about minorities. That's not totally the case. I mean, I taught in an economically disadvantaged high school here where we do the show from, and its student body is over 87% white.
So one of the things that I think is good about this, because the whole point of today's show, right, is regardless of where you come down on whether you're one of those people celebrating or mourning the end of it, or maybe you don't really know, that's not what today's show is about. Today's show is, it is what it is, right? The decision's been made. So now what is next? How will colleges respond? And is there an opportunity to do more that may actually help with race, but isn't strictly about race? And that's part of what I think, again, to Lance's point, that's what's exciting about today's show is, if nothing else, there's two opportunities before us that we get to talk about today that are ideas that, I mean, when I read them, I was kind of thinking like the whole time, why aren't we doing these things anyway? Why? There's a lot of different things to talk about as far as whether these exact ideas are it, but why did it take this to bring these to the forefront? These are both things.
Well, it's because you had something in place that everybody, as the article points out, has been in existence for 55 years. So this is something that I know about, right? Because being, the boomer here, that this has been in vogue since my entire life. So I remember affirmative action. I remember the Bakke case, reverse discrimination. This has been a part of my upbringing. And they pointed out that one of the leaders, I think, of the NAACP said we need to do this for 10 years. Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court justice, said we need to do it for 100 years. We did it for 55. So the reason we haven't looked at anything else is because we had this and thought it was addressing the problem. Now that we don't have it, then it makes us look at, those of us who care about solving problems, okay, we were working with this to solve a problem. Now it's been taken away. What are other ways to solve the problem?
So this article is actually by Richard Kallenberg, and I think his contention is, he says right here in the article, since the 1980s, I've been researching and writing about the possibility of using socioeconomic disadvantage rather than race as a basis for preference in competitive college admissions. Mr. Kallenberg is an education and housing consultant, and he's also a scholar at Georgetown University. So what he looked at and what they pointed out in this article, and you can look at this across different universities, but the one they used was North Carolina's the University of North Carolina. So, and I think this illustrates sort of the challenge really well of what did affirmative action accomplish, but what did it also not accomplish, right? And so that's kind of what this chart is laying out. So they say you sorted all the 17-year-olds in North Carolina into groups based on their race and ethnicity. The distribution would look like this: 55% white, 21% black, 12% Hispanic, 10% other. Okay. The University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which has used race as a factor for admission, has a comparably diverse undergraduate class. So remember that if we'd sorted North Carolina's population by race, it was 55% white. Well, at UNC, it's 56% white. It's 21% black in the state, 9% at the university, 10% Hispanic at the university, 12% in the state, 1% Asian in the state, 13% Asian at UNC, and 13% other, 10% other in the state. So, I mean, all told, no, it's not a one-for-one match, but clearly, right, what affirmative action has led to.
Affirmative action was bringing in diversity on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Exactly. But now, and here's the second part of the story, right? Okay, so one could use that and say, well, then by that measure, affirmative action kind of did accomplish what it was supposed to do. So maybe it's not needed. Or maybe it doesn't solve everything that has to be solved. It solved a particular set of challenges. So now say that you split North Carolina's households with 17-year-olds into fifths based on their income. So the first quintile, second quintile, third, fourth, and fifth quintile, right? 5 quintiles. 20% is each group. So 20% in North Carolina are in households that are less than 35,000. 20% are 35 to 62,000. 30% or 20%, are 62,000 to 93,000. 20% are 93,000 to 146,000, and 20% are above 146,000. So it's very even amongst the quintiles. If you sorted the families of Chapel Hill's undergrads into America's household income quintiles, the school seems a lot less diverse. More than half of Chapel Hill students come from the country's richest families in the fifth quintile, almost 60% of the students. Remember that only 20% of North Carolina families, households fall into that fifth quintile, but 60% of Chapel Hill's fall into that. And 20% fall into the fourth quintile, which is that 93,000 or more, 93,000 to 146,000, when only 20% of North Carolina does. So if you put that together, just for perspective, right, 40% in North Carolina are 93,000 or more in household income. Okay. But at UNC, almost 80%, almost double, are 93,000 or above. And only 4% come from the first quintile, which is that less than 35,000 group.
So for those of you, I'm going to simplify it because I need it simplified because Justin's looking at it and reading it. But it sounds like to me what we've done in this case is that, yes, it's diverse in skin color and culture, but it's not diverse in socioeconomic or in monetary fashion. Right. They've gone out and been able to find wealthy minority families and get their kids into school, which is the whole premise here. And one of the quotes is from Dr. Martin Luther King, because many people don't realize that when, the last 2 or 3 years of Dr. King's life before he was sadly assassinated, he had switched from totally just a black equality message and had been attacking poverty in the United States. And King said something to the effect that we should not do affirmative action. We should do it based on socioeconomic because we need to bring along the disadvantaged economic white people as well, because that's like 40% of the white population. And so we get them on our side rather than not liking us. Because so if you just do it, yeah, Black people need help, according to Dr. King, but it's poor people that are a bigger group that need help. And we need to address all poor people, just not poor people of color. And that was Dr. King that said that over 50 years ago.
Right. Well, and the other notion too, I think part of what he's getting at, right, and King said it's a simple matter of justice in his book, Why We Can't Wait, the Forgotten White Poor should be included in a program of some type of affirmative action, because he recognized that a class-based approach would bring along working class white people as political allies, and that a purely race-based approach could alienate them. And it doesn't say this, but one of the things that I think is an important sentiment as you read the article is it may only solve part of the problem, which is part of what those statistics I just shared highlight, right?
So the argument of this author is that we haven't solved racism. It still exists, but we have a bigger problem on our hands now, and that is the wealth inequality gap.
Right. At Harvard,
because nobody's out there saying racism's gone or there's not discrimination has been done away with. Nobody's saying that. But what this gentleman is arguing is that there's a bigger problem, and the bigger problem
we're ignoring a bigger
is
problem,
the wealth gap.
And if you address the wealth gap, you're going to address.
Instead of making people adversaries, as Dr. King said, you might bring them together because they really have more in common than they think they do because of the socioeconomic status of both groups.
At Harvard, 71% of Black and Hispanic students came from the top socioeconomic fifth of Black and Hispanic populations nationally. All told, both Harvard and UNC had about 15 times as many wealthy as poor students on campus. We're going to talk more about, so what is the potential solution to that? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. According to Richard Kallenberg, who is an education and housing consultant as well as a scholar at Georgetown University, new class-based preferences could be structured to promote fairness in admissions that produces both race and class diversity. For universities, the lowest hanging fruit are the unfair preferences for the children of alumni, professors, and other staff members, and for athletes in boutique sports like fencing and squash. Those preferences effectively serve as affirmative action for the rich and have to go, as should preferences for those who apply early, a scheme that tends to benefit wealthy students. Colleges should admit more highly talented community college transfers, as top institutions like UCLA and Amherst do. They should more vigorously recruit the nation's estimated 35,000 low-income high achievers, a vast majority of whom do not apply to selective colleges. And flagship public colleges should accept students with the very highest grades in their state's high schools, irrespective of SAT scores, as the University of Texas, Austin has done. Most important, admission officers at public and private colleges should provide a meaningful admission lift to economically disadvantaged students who perform well despite the odds. Skeptics would say that looking at class will mostly help white students, since white people in 2021 constituted 43% of poor Americans. 20% of poor people were Black, 28% were Hispanic, and 5% were Asian. Some of the early research on using economic disadvantage in admission suggests that looking at income would not produce much racial diversity. But research that goes beyond a simple income and education-based definition of economic disadvantage has found that colleges can produce significant racial and class diversity by considering a more complete set of socioeconomic factors that include family net worth and the neighborhood and school conditions of an applicant.
So there are schools that are doing other things besides just affirmative action to try to bring in disadvantaged students. So it's not like we don't have to start at zero. There are some things out there, but then he gets into, and what we talked about this topic on this show is, your zip code, your housing, where you are, right? And then the problem with the disparity in public education, that there are some public schools that get very good education, because like in Ohio, each community gets to determine how much they want to spend on each student.
Yeah.
So if you live in Ohio, it depends on how much your local economy wants to support education as to what kind of education you get. And so there's a lot of disparity even within Ohio on how much is, what is offered at different public high schools. We're not even going into the whole private and charter school thing, which he's addressing as well.
Yeah.
In that area.
Well, because for example, like you take our producer who is in high school right now, right? Our intern, and you look at, well, he could take all of the top everything at his current school, right? And if somebody else, say in a Dublin neighborhood, which is a suburb of Columbus,
in a wealthier suburb,
right,
we're talking about socioeconomic differences,
right? Who's going to say, a private school takes everything that they can take. Well, if we look at their two applications and there's no consideration given to the fact that Levi literally he did everything that he could do at his school, right? There was no other opportunity other than what was taken advantage of. There were no other extracurriculars. There were no other intracurriculars. Like he took them, or
that they don't have the top math and science classes,
right?
The
well,
top,
you never took,
trigonometry. You never took.
Well, my school doesn't offer that.
Exactly.
So how is it fair, right? But because that's what we're talking about. How is it fair that I don't get admitted,
but you go 30 minutes away to a different public high school
that offers trigonometry?
They have that offer.
Right.
And now you put that on a college.
Because it looks like
and you both apply to Harvard.
Right.
Who looks better?
Yeah. Well, clearly, the person that took trigonometry and did well, I'm like, well, you didn't even take trigonometry. And of course, the response would be, if they were able to take more things into account, well, that's because it wasn't offered, not because I wasn't willing to take it. It wasn't an option. So I think that to me is one of the central pieces of this is it brings a fuller picture, right, of what did the candidate achieve based on the opportunity that was before them? Because really that's what, and I think that speaks to a larger thing of when we talk about, well, what do we want to be in America, right? Well, what we want to be is recognizing how well somebody seized opportunity, right? How did they overcome the challenges and obstacles that were put in front of them? Well, looking at a simple measure of did you take this class or that class or this extracurricular or that extracurricular, because of how diverse our public school system is, that is not the best way to determine what obstacles and adversity somebody's overcome and what opportunities they've seized, right? Because the other thing is you could say like, okay, well, you say that you participated in 80% of extracurriculars. This other student participated in 100%. Well, it looks like at face value that other person was more involved and therefore should get better preference. Well, what if at your school the participation rate was 20%? Or what if you had 15 more extracurriculars and you participated at 80%? There's all those kinds of things where if you don't account for the differences in the schools themselves, you're trying to use measures that are going to give preference to schools and institutions where more opportunity is available. And generally speaking, you could contend less obstacles have to be overcome to take advantage of those opportunities.
So you go like to the University of Texas at Austin that says, we're not going to look, and more schools are doing this, we're not going to look at a standardized test score. But if you went to a Texas public high school and you did really well, we're going to weigh that more heavily than your SAT score, because we're going to give credence to the fact that you went to one of our state's high schools and therefore hopefully you are prepared.
Right.
And I think we need to do some things like that, but we need to do it because we need to put pressure on the public schools to do a better job. I was, a 30 plus year public school teacher. So I'm all for public schools, but you can't just keep sliding by on your coattails when people are producing high school students better than you are.
It's easy and incorrect to say that we're going to measure two public school students from different states the same way. That is a disservice. It's a disservice to our nation because.
But then the question is, what do you do?
You're accidentally admitting people who may not have actually overcome more obstacles than the person who on paper didn't look as good. And that's why I think this system, part of why this is exciting
well,
is
and even
because
if you come from a disadvantaged high school, your parents may be in that higher income group. So did you even have to overcome as much as somebody in your own high school?
Even in your own school. Yeah. And so I think, and part of the point, right, part of what the data in here is revealing is that you can say, well, we want it to be fair and equitable, right? Like we figured out that on race, a lot of universities are doing better at being representative of the population on race. They really are, a lot of headways been made, and that's terrific. But they're not doing very well on the whole at representing our nation's wealth. They are disproportionately representing by a huge margin. Our top universities by a huge margin are representing not most Americans.
And then the question is, where does this fall in the eyes of politicians? Are politicians going to get interested in this? Because you and I both know.
Well, they're in those upper quintiles.
Exactly.
I mean,
but who are the voters? Who are the people who support them? So are we going to get a buy-in from politicians? Because we talk about it all the time. The Supreme Court just makes decisions based on the laws that are written. Are there some new laws out there? I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm a independent Democrat or Republican, I would jump on this and say, wait a minute, there's this economic gap. I'm going to make it easier for students who come from economically disadvantaged households to go to college. I'm going to get votes, right? I mean, you would think, but
I would think so.
Are the politicians as smart as I am to figure that out? Or are they going to keep saying, which is a complaint that I've heard, the wealthy people want to keep it so that their children can get the jobs and keep the wealth in their families. They don't want to open it up to real competition.
Right. Well, and that's
they mouthpiece competition.
Yeah.
Well, we want competitive schools. We want competitive education. Well,
we just explained that the data shows that that's not what's happening.
You're not doing it, right? So what are you going to do? What laws are you going to pass, either Democrat or Republican, to put your money where your mouth is, to make it a more competitive environment for all students?
Because keep in mind, I mean, some of the universities, right, that are contained in this data are very liberal East Coast institutions. So we're not talking about. This isn't a specific Republican Democrat issue. This is across higher education that you're seeing this favorability toward.
But it comes from the public school system too.
Right.
I mean, if you don't make a better public school system,
which is what we're going to talk about next,
you can't get, right? You can't get the qualifications for students to be successful, because let's face it, we don't want it to be, because this is something that historically from the high school I worked in just tore me up. The number of students who would go to college and then come back and not finish because for a variety of reasons. But one, they weren't prepared enough. They weren't challenged enough to be able to stick it out, to suck it up and say, this is hard. And why wasn't it? Well, because we didn't make high school hard enough for them. Right? We didn't make the classes challenging enough. We maybe had the right title on the classes, but we didn't make it hard enough for them because there was pressure to graduate them. So, I mean, we have to approach and address all of these issues so that these young people who want to try to bridge that gap get the background to do it, right? Yeah. They get the tools in their toolbox to do it.
Yeah. To begin with, the public, though deeply skeptical of racial preference, based on what I just explained, supports class-based preferences by 61% to 39%. So, you have this margin of people that say we're not comfortable as a public anymore saying that we're strictly going to give a preference based on race. But you also have a public who's very comfortable saying, right, not just a majority, but a healthy majority say that class-based preferences are important, and that if you don't take those into account, you're not being fair. So, okay, we know that. What do we do about building better feeding into colleges? Because part of it's not just, I think that's what we've highlighted in this section of public schools aren't one for one. And even Even more so when you go public-private, they're definitely not one-for-one, which makes considering applicants more tricky, which is why socioeconomic background can be important. What else can be done about that? Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Roland Fryer is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a professor of economics at Harvard, and a co-founder of Equal Opportunity Ventures, which invests in businesses that increase opportunity in America. He writes in the New York Times, in the months leading up to the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, news reports gave us a sense of how selective colleges were planning to respond, in part by watering down their admission standards through policies like reducing or eliminating the role of standardized tests. The thinking goes, if there aren't enough Black and Hispanic applicants who can perform at the college level would normally require, then schools should drop some key measures of performance in order to admit those students. Roland Fryer's claim is that that is precisely backwards. Instead of making the admission process shallow, elite colleges should deepen the applicant pool. The simplest, most direct way to do that is for these schools to found and fund schools that educate disadvantaged students. Right now, colleges take the supply of qualified minority students as fixed. They might run a summer enrichment program for local kids, but they don't intervene in students' education in systemic ways. They don't teach the higher order skills that students need to get into college. They don't cultivate the grit and resilience that kids need to navigate a challenging curriculum after they are admitted. They rely on existing schools to do that. And if those schools routinely fail minority students, well, that's a problem with pre-college pipeline. To undertake such a project, elite institutions would have to believe two things: that they can afford it and that there are enough Ivy League caliber schools trapped in poorly performing high schools to make it worthwhile. Both of those things actually happen to be true. A back-to-the-envelope calculation demonstrates that affordability isn't a serious question. The eight Ivy League schools combined, to say nothing of other highly selective colleges, have an endowment worth about $200 billion, a figure that's expected to exceed $1 trillion by 2048, an enrollment of around 70,000 undergrads. Say that they'd spend $20,000 per child per year, about the average annual tuition at the country's K through 12 private schools. That would be enough to provide high-quality after-school programming and other support that children from disadvantaged backgrounds may need, similar to the model developed by Harlem Children's Zone. Under these assumptions, the cost would be about $4 billion, or put another way, about 2% of the Ivy League's total endowment. The cost could be offset by fundraising specifically for the academics. One could even add 3 years of middle school without getting close to the $10 billion mark. If we believe intervention must start sooner and staffing these schools would not be a real challenge, their prestige would draw in talented teachers and leaders from inside and outside education.
In the last segment, you were talking about how some students that don't get the extracurricular classes are kind of at a disadvantage. But some of those kids, whether they have more extracurricular or not, have CCP classes they can take online that have millions of different classes, different topics you can take.
That's true. But how motivated are those students going to be if they come from a socioeconomic background to even know that that exists? Now you're saying, oh, they can take them online. How many of these students have computers? How many of them have internet at home? So,
or
yes,
a quiet place to work at home.
So you've just been, okay, yeah, you can do this online on your own if A, you have a device, B, you have a quiet place, and C, your family has internet at home. And
exactly.
But COVID showed us that there are millions of public school children who do not have the internet at home.
Right.
So therefore, those students, and those are probably from economic disadvantaged homes, most likely, right? So the students we're talking about are the ones that would least likely have the internet so that they could take those types of classes to enhance their learning ability.
Well, Justin used me as an example, and he was like, well, my school that I'm taking now might not have the same opportunities as others of getting into colleges because of my extracurricular, but we have access to online
As
courses.
long as you have a quiet place at home, you have supportive parents,
And you take the initiative.
and you have the internet, and you take the initiative.
Right. But
But not everybody has those things at home.
how
Not everybody goes home to supportive parents. Not everybody goes home to
which is true.
to a house that has internet access. Not everybody goes home to a computer that they could do these classes on.
But
well, and if COVID taught us anything, I mean, I think this is the other one is how did your grades do during COVID, Levi?
they were poor.
Okay. And you had to do stuff online,
Mhm,
right? So one thing that we know, I mean, from the pandemic that we tested across capabilities and in supportive households is that online learning is not a one-for-one substitute with in-person learning for some students, right? For a lot of students, it's not. So do you have access to quote unquote the same opportunities that everybody else has? I suppose you could say so, but they have access to a teacher in the room. They have access to a guidance counselor that says, I know this teacher. I know other people in this class. Go sit in this class. Oh, my friend's taking this class. I'm going to take this class. If I need help, I can go to them. There are a lot of in-person benefits that are easy to discount. I think it's great that we have that, right? Because that's certainly better than nothing.
Right.
I mean, the alternative would be, well, you just can't take them. But how many people do you know that are utilizing that? What percentage of your high school do you think is utilizing those programs?
Not very many right now. Well, I mean, CCP is just kind of a new thing that's coming along anyways.
It's been around for 10 years.
Well, taking it online.
At the school you go to, it's been around for 10, 15 years. Okay.
Yeah.
The issue was nobody wanted to do it.
Yeah.
It's been available, but nobody ever applied to do it. That's our point. Who's taking the initiative to do it? It's been around. I mean, I'm old, and it was around when I was there. And you and I have talked about that, right? That you wished I had, you had me for part of 8th grade before COVID, but I wasn't at the high school when you went there. And so it's been around for a while, but nobody takes advantage of it. And that's our point, is because there are enough other classes at your high school that you can fill your schedule. And so you have to be really...
It's up to the student, basically.
Yes. And you have to have that support from home or from the counselor or from your teachers in the building to say, you need to do this. We need to push you a little bit further. Now, what we're talking about though here in this other article, this gentleman's saying, you know what? Don't make them take it. Don't make CCP. Don't make them take it online. Make the colleges pay for schools that bring those students in and give them the classroom learning that they're trying to get. And he points out that the top, what we call the Ivy League schools and some of the top public schools have plenty of money that they're sitting on right now. So why not? It's not going to cost them a whole lot because one, okay, it's an investment, right? When you and I have talked about investments. If you invest this and educate 35,000 students a year, well, that's 35,000 new qualified applicants you have to go to your school. How much money are you going to make off of them?
Online CCP classes, things like the ability to go take college classes, those are all, I mean, in my mind, I think it's good that you bring them up, Levi, because they are what we're talking about in the show. They're, in a lot of ways, they're kind of like what affirmative action has been. We had to do something, right? And we all felt like we have to do something about this because it's not right that in the 21st century that if Levi's going to a school in a relatively rural area, just because they don't have classes, he can't take them. Well, we have computers, so we could fix this, right? Online classes like that, that's going to help. It does help, right? It is a good thing to do. It's kind of like affirmative action in that way. It does make it better, but it's never going to take it all the way because it can't, because it's not going to replicate the experience that the other group's getting. It's going to get you closer to that, right? And that's part of what we covered in the first segment was explaining we've made headway, right, on racial diversity on college campus. We've made headway on that. We are better than we used to be, and we're more reflective of the population than we used to be. That's wonderful. But maybe affirmative action has taken us as far as it can, right? And now we have to look at what haven't we addressed? Well, we haven't fully addressed this. We've put some things in place, and maybe CCP, which has been around for 10 years now, online CCP, and access to go take college courses on campus, the participation rate hasn't drastically improved since when I was at Urbana High School. So what that tells us is it's probably taken us as far as it can, right? Yes, it does provide some opportunities for some students. Yes, some students are better off because that's available. Could more students be better off if we did something that was even better? That we just identified could be afforded without costing taxpayers an additional dime. I mean, that's a big thing, because everybody's always concerned about, and we should be, about how much our government's spending. This guy's proposal isn't talking about any new government money. It's saying, let's use the private money that already exists and let's have these top institutions who are supposedly the best in the world at educating people. If they're the best in the world, why don't we have them involved in primary school education? I mean, we have it totally backwards. The United States has the best higher education systems in the world, and we have some of the worst early childhood education systems in the world. You can't expect to break the cycle if you don't give access to these things to the people who most need them. The supportive, challenging, rewarding environments that our higher education system is really good at doing, if you can get there. And we're all about, well, how do we get more kids into college? Why aren't we talking about how do we make a high school and a middle school and a primary school education better? We're all about, well, let's more education. Why don't we make the education that we already offer better? That seems to be the place to start, rather than saying, well, let's push more of them out of our education that we're offering to everybody into college because that'll fix it. Again, it's kind of what he said. It's backwards, I think. We're not starting in the right spot. Why do we have the show today, Lance?
Well, because first I thank Levi for his input, because it stoked the fires of the conversation.
Well, and he's living in one of these places, in one of these schools.
And he's in school. So
yeah,
hear it from the horse's mouth, right? I mean, we're not just.
And somebody that's thinking about going to college, right?
Right.
I mean, in fairness.
And who I've seen show grit working on his homework. And he's, this chemistry is kicking my butt, Mr. Jackson. I'm just, but he's in there every night working on it. But anyway, but we had it because True Chat has a mission, and that mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And this one today, especially, we're trying to find a solution to solve the problem of inequities. And so instead of just hanging your head and saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? We've given you some things that we can chew on and talk about and maybe implement. So if you enjoyed today's show, share it with others. Tell them if they'd like to listen to us as a podcast, they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us releases new episodes Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the morning as a podcast. Those same episodes are heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the United States and parts of Canada. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording associate producer, Levi LaForge, and of course our senior producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.